In today's tutorial, we'll cover what Passthrough API is, a simple use case for Passthrough, and we'll walk through an example using Postman to access Alloy's Passthrough API. Now, what is Passthrough API? Passthrough API allows ISVs or software vendors using Alloy to access raw data from any endpoint we do not support out of the box using the credentials a user has already provided. And so a good use case for that, or an example for that, would be if you're trying to support the abandoned cart endpoint to send marketing emails encouraging users to complete their checkouts. As long as you already have access to the credentials that the user has provided originally when connecting their Shopify store to your app, you would be able to access data from this abandoned cart endpoint. So even if Alloy does not offer that endpoint right out of the box, you can simply go to the Shopify documentation, use the same credentials that the user has provided or that your end user has provided earlier when connecting their store to your app, and then access that endpoint and fetch the data that you need from the abandoned cart endpoint. And today, you can use Passthrough API with all of our UAPI connectors. You can also use it with a limited number of connectors from our embedded list of connectors. Now, in today's demo, we're going to use Passthrough API to access all of the abandoned carts from a user's Shopify store. And if you want to learn more about Passthrough, you can simply go to the docs at docs.runalloy.com/docs/Passthrough API. Now let's get into the demo. I'm going to open up Postman here on my screen, and I'm going to show you how to access the abandoned cart endpoint on Shopify. So first, I'm going to navigate to the Shopify documentation, and right here in the docs, we've navigated here to the retrieve the list of abandoned checkouts endpoint, and we see that the endpoint that we need to call is actually /checkouts.json. And when we call that endpoint, it's going to return to us a list of abandoned checkouts or abandoned carts that the user has not completed. Next thing, I'm going to pop open Postman. Now with Postman open, we're going to attempt to make a call to the checkout endpoint on Shopify. This is going to be a post request, so our Passthrough APIs only accept post requests. And remember that we'll be able to access the underlying data returned by this endpoint. Now the first URL that you need here is the base URL, and you can find this very quickly on the Alloy documentation website. You also need the API version, so pretty much every quarter we'll release a new updated API version. And right now we're at 2024-03 for the API version. And then you call the /passthrough endpoint, and you also pass a credential ID to this endpoint as well. Now, depending on what app you're working with, for example, we're working with Shopify in this tutorial, so we're going to be passing the Shopify credential ID, and I'm also going to show you how to find that credential ID right now. So if you come into the Alloy Unified API dashboard and you come into connections, if you click this button right here, now with every connection that your user has made to your application, you'll be able to fetch a credential ID for that user. Alloy automatically creates this credential ID on the back end, and you'll be able to fetch this credential ID. I can simply copy this and paste this into Postman, and I can use this credential ID to make requests for this user. Another way to access your credential ID is by simply calling the credentials endpoint, which is also available in the Alloy documentation. Now, when we come back to Postman, we know that we need to call the /checkouts endpoint here, which we saw earlier in the Shopify docs. So I'm going to change this to /checkouts.json. And with all of that completed, remember that this is already a variable that I set earlier in Postman, pretty much using one of the users that's connected their Shopify accounts to my app. So I'm going to, all of these variables have been set globally within my Postman, and I'm just going to click the send button here. Now this should return to me all of the abandoned carts in a user Shopify store. Now I'm using delete endpoint here, but this should actually be a get method, and we can confirm that. So if I go back into the Shopify documentation, this takes a get request. So I'm going to change this to get, and I'm going to hit send again. And this should now correctly return all of the abandoned checkouts within a user's Shopify store. And this is how you use Alloy's Passthrough API feature to access the raw underlying data from any endpoint that Alloy does not support out of the box.